Welcome to Lecture 4 in Teaching Creative Writing with Dave Lorden. This is the first of two lectures on teaching adults, and I'm going to, in the two lectures, I'm going to do a couple of sample classes and give you the outline of a basic 10-week course for teaching general adults, okay? But most of the teaching in Teaching Creative Writing for Adults is general or introductory courses, evening classes, Saturday classes, things like that. But I'm just going to say, ask the question first today, what can you teach adults? And this kind of comes back to, what you know yourself. You can't really teach people what you know yourself. And to know writing is to have practiced writing. So if you're going to try and teach people how to write a novel, you'll have to have written a novel and also have published a novel, and that kind of thing. Not just have 3 or 4 in your in your press at home. Okay, so 3 types of courses, like I say: 1 general introductory, 2 professional and genre. So if you're a crime writer, you can teach a crime writing. If you're a poet, you can teach a poet. Again, a published poet, a published crime writer, etc., etc. Not just a notion that you're going to be one, but one that's kind of gone through with it. And 3rd, the niche and extra literary. Okay, so there's a lot. I mean, the creative writing field is basically infinite, and what is happening at the moment is the creative writing itself is hybridizing with other fields, particularly in therapy, things like teen services, end-of-life care, mental health services, all that kind of stuff. So a lot of my students over the last couple of years have gone on to develop kind of niche courses or extra literary courses, which combine that kind of therapeutic thing with literature itself. But there's also niche courses in, if you're interested in a kind of a less popular today kind of literature. I teach a course on experimental fiction, which is the fiction of Joyce and Beckett and stuff like that. Not a lot of people interested in it, but the people who are interested are very interested in it. I fill that course so often, I'd say 10 times at this stage now. So a niche course is a good one to have if you have a particular interest, because of course with the general and introductory and the professional courses, you will be in competition with a hell of a lot of other writers, especially if you live in a big city like Dublin, where everybody's in competition with everybody else. Okay, so questions to ask yourself where you decide what you're going to teach adults. First, are you interested in the topic? You have to be really interested. If you're going to do a professional or a niche course, it'll be something that you want to develop yourself. Okay. Are you knowledgeable? Again, this comes back to you don't know how to write a novel or really anything about writing a novel unless you've written one, published one, and it's been out there and reviewed and all that sort of stuff. Self-publishing really doesn't do it here, I don't think, unfortunately, generally, okay? Are you qualified is the same question, so do you know and are you qualified to teach the thing? Don't try and teach people something that you haven't done yourself, because that's racketeering, okay? But everybody can teach a general introductory course. Everybody who's done this course can teach a general introductory course, obviously, because you're interested by being here. Okay, some general points to do with teaching adults, which are really important. One is you have to plan and cater for a mix of abilities, a mix of interests, a mix of levels of motivation. Okay, so a general introductory adult class, you'll have people that are very smart, who read loads of books. You'll have people that haven't read a book for years. You'll have people that are used to being in adult education, and you'll have people that haven't been in school for 30, 40 years. You'll have people that are barely literate, even illiterate, I've come across, or functionally illiterate, and you'll have extremely eloquent people. Okay, you'll have people that are very shy. You'll have people that are kind of hogging the space all the time and won't shut up, etc. Right? And you'll have people that are mad to do loads of homework and mad to get their homework corrected and stuff like that. And you'll also have people who might show up half the time or not show up at all. A typical experience in an adult class for me you'd start with maybe 12. Not all 12 of them know what they're doing there. 1 or 2 of them have been sent there by their wives to get them out of the house on a Monday night. They probably won't come back on the second night when they find out about it. So usually classes go in an adult class around 10 week long. You end up with about 7 or 8 no matter what you start with, because for various reasons people find out that they're not into it, and you have to expect that and not beat yourself up over it. Okay, you have to, one thing you have to really do with adults quite a lot is you have to manage expectations quite a bit, because people come in very naively and they've had an idea that now I'm going to write a thriller or a women's fiction or a crime novel or a vampire novel or a children's book. Everybody's trying to write a children's book at the moment, or a crime novel, that they're going to write that, and then suddenly their mortgage will be paid off and they'll be on the Late Late Show and things like that. And basically all they have to do is say they're going to do it and it'll happen. So managing expectations with some of those adult writers who come in with mad naive idea of the publishing industry, you have to really kind of manage expectations, but you also have to set realistic goals and keep people going. And the first couple of weeks, which we're going to talk about this time, are very important for you, finding out about the actual students that you have and what they can do. Okay, and the third thing you have to do, and this is kind of prepare yourself and prepare the rest of the class, is to prepare for and learn how to handle disturbing material. This is particularly the case in Ireland, particularly the case if you're working, I would say, with women over the age of 50. As in my experience, an awful lot of those women in Ireland have been through abuse, domestic violence, abuse at the hands of nuns or teachers, or everybody used to beat up women in Ireland not so long ago, and that will come out. I had a class that sometimes comes out, not always. People do come with a secret sometimes to an adult class that they want to share. I had a class once where three of the women, it turned out during the course of what they were writing, had all been raped by their fathers, and one of the guys in the class had been gang raped in his school, his kind of posh British school, years earlier. Now, that was a kind of an unusual event, but you will have stuff coming out that might be disturbing, and you have to manage that. You have to allow people to say their piece, obviously, but you also have to look after everybody else in the class, and you have to look after your own head and stuff like that. But disturbing material will come up with adults. Adults sometimes come into conflict with each other and fight with each other, whereas you don't want to be bringing up the big hot topics of the day all the time. It's kind of hard to keep them out of the room as well at times. So again, learning that. I mean, I once had a class where I had a Palestinian who'd been thrown out of Palestine, and a Russian fellow going to Israel, about to go to Israel to basically take your man's house off him. So managing that, I had people with from two sides of the Angolan civil war fighting with each other, and in the class, so that can come up. So just be prepared for that kind of. Adults are teens are hard, but when adults are fighting with each other, it can be a bit messier and stuff like that. So it's not all peace and love and flowers and birds and bees, and adults are all kinds of people with all different levels. So just be prepared for that. I would say that you need a 10-week course for adults, but you can shrink this down to 6 or 8. Maybe 8 is probably better, actually. 10 weeks sometimes in the winter particularly can be quite a long time for adults to kind of commit to, because adults, remember, have a lot more commitments and a lot more responsibilities and a lot more baggage. So 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks at a stretch, but I'm going to give you the 10-week outline, and then you can kind of pick and choose from that if you like, okay? I would 3 phases. So I would say week 1, 2, and 3 is what I call the construction phase, where you're kind of generating material and getting to know them, so that you have something to move forward into phase 2, which is production. And at that stage, you'll have set kind of individual targets and individual exercise for your class, and you'll be working with them in the different genres and things like that, and pushing them forward. That's most of the class. That's weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and week 9 then is completion. So getting people to learn how to edit their own work, and maybe putting together a little magazine or putting on a show or something like that. So that's a 3-week. In the first phase, which is the construction phase or the generation phase, if you like, it's all about introductions. It's about establishing rapport. If you don't know what rapport means, it's a big thing in teaching, which is basically getting on with the students, them all getting on with each other, and there being a good, positive, productive atmosphere that everybody feels able to contribute to. Okay, you're also confidence building in the first part. You're never going to play the literary critic. You're never going to, you're not going to set very many challenging exercises in the first part, but it's all about getting people to, to become creative, get into the swing of creativity, get into the swing of sharing their work and feeding back on it. So very gentle stuff in the first couple of weeks. That's generating material, getting started as a creative writer, basically. I'll go on now and look at different exercises and writing points we can cover, among them cliche proofing. So everybody should learn, not to say, her eyes, they shone like black diamonds, or, her smile was like the sun on a Sunday morning, or anything terribly cliched like that. You've got to find exercises to get them look for saying things in their own words. And saying things in their own words is what I call natural writing. And then redundancy, a third writing point there, which is simply using too many words, or repeating yourself, or using 3 words where only 1 word, and things like that. So, that's something that you yourself need to be quite skilled as a writer and an editor to spot and to teach. So I'm assuming you are those things, but I'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of exercise and things like that. As I said, the first 3 weeks are weeks where we're trying to generate material and build confidence. Okay, so I'm going to give you 9 different things which you can base those kind of exercises on. Okay, the first I'm going to give you is an exercise on based on around personal memories. Now I'm going to give you suggested exercises But it's really, you should go off and make up your own exercise, because, like I say, you're going to be a lot better as a creative writing teacher if you yourself are generating your exercises and not using ones you pick up on the internet, or not using ones you've taken from me, but put your own spin on them. But these are things you can base them on. Personal memories. One thing I would do with people is a thing called personal memory. Is obviously a great thing for creative writing. An infinite store, really, if you know how to tap into it, and to stimulate people into do exercises. Everybody's got a lot of memories, good memories, bad memories, and so on and so forth. One thing I find they like doing, and has worked for me quite a lot, is what I call a lost friend exercise. Okay, so everybody's got a friend, haven't they, that they were great friends with in college, or they were great friends with in primary school, or they were great friends that time they went to London for the summer when they were 19, etc., etc. They haven't seen them since, they know nothing about them, okay? So they have to write, basically, the biography of the person since they last met them, what has happened to them, okay? And they have to make it up. They have to make it up based on what they knew about the friend at the time, and the kind of the trajectory of the personality of the friend, the career of the friend, all that sort of stuff, and where they ended up and what they're doing. And people can have a lot of fun with that. Quite nostalgic for them, but also it's something that they've also been thinking about, at the back of their head. Where has this person gone? What has happened to them? This is the lover I took in 1979. For 3 weeks in India or whatever. Where are they now? Okay, so that one has been very, very good. Personal memories, but then make up your own exercises on personal memories. That's really important, like I say, okay? Another material generation exercise I would use in the first 3 weeks would be family lore. And that would be anything to do with mad stuff that happened in the family, or interesting stuff that happened in the family. The crazy uncle, the auntie who traveled the world, the baby who got thrown in the fire by mistake. My entire first book was made out of family lore, really, and there's so much of it. And of course, once you go back 2 or 3 generations, it becomes a lot easier for people to write about. And when it's not kind of their own direct family, their own mother and father and stuff like that, but it's somebody that's kind of at one remove to them. Where they've been, where they've travelled, what they did, who they married. Everybody's got some interesting relative that they can drag to a class and tell everybody about and share about. And again, that's been a very, very successful exercise for me. And again, make your own version of it. Okay. So local stories and histories. Now, this one comes up an awful lot, and to get people to collect the lore, again, putting the emphasis on people telling more than their own story. Is something you try to get across in the first couple of weeks. So that it's not all about me, being a creative writer, but there's a community role for a creative writer, and local stories and histories. Are the way that you kind of bring this into the class. I had a very a woman one time, and she was a very interesting woman. She lived in a small townland in the hills of Wicklow. And she was confused about what to write about. She couldn't come up with any material. So I said, have you any? You must have a few ghost stories up there. So we do, actually. My grandfather tells them. So she went off and she collected his ghost story. And then for the whole rest of the time, she was collecting ghost stories from the townland where she lived, from the old people that lived in the townland. And by the end of the 10 weeks, she had a little pamphlet of local ghost stories. And that's the kind of project I've repeated with people over and over again now, getting them to collect it, especially if the place is kind of, old or passing away, or there's a lot of old people about, and there's kind of an urgency about collecting those stories. Local history journals I also point people towards as inspiration for stories. You could use a story from a local history journal or any kind of local journal as inspiration for people to create new stories out of, okay? So all of the events, Dolphin's Barn in Dublin, for example, was bombed by the Nazis. The Dublin Monaghan bombings on Talbot Street, the First World War, battalion that left from Greystones was your grandfather, and that all local stories and histories that people go back up and they imaginatively enter into. You can write it as non-fiction, or you can write it as historical fiction, or whatever. You can put a genre spin on it like that. So again, that's 3. Now let's look at another 3 sets of sort of material generating exercises that work in those first 3 weeks. Okay. Dreams and nightmares. These are really something that personal about people, but they usually don't mind sharing too much. I'll start with your strangest dream, your worst nightmare. Okay, one exercise. Get people to write it out and compare them and talk about them and talk about imagery and symbolism. You can talk about when you're doing dreams, why certain images and symbols carry so much meaning, and can you make use of them in your writing. A fun exercise I use is based on people may have heard heard of the exquisite corpse exercise of the surrealists, where basically somebody wrote a line and then you pass it on to the next person and they don't see the line, but they write a line underneath it, and then they fold it up so nobody can see it, and the next person writes a line underneath it. So you can do that, or you can get people to write out the first paragraph of their dream and then pass it on to the person beside them, who must write the second paragraph, and pass it on to the second person beside them, who must write the third paragraph. That's a really good exercise to do in groups of 4, and at the end of that, that's about 40 minutes long, and at the end of that you've got these really cool weird stories that people are really surprised that they've made, and it's great for confidence building and fun and crack, so I recommend that one. Hopes and fears. Okay. So you talk to people about what's their greatest fear, what's their greatest hope, and then write as if they were realized. So their greatest fear is spiders, so they have to write as if they're in a box of spiders or a coffin full of spiders or whatever. Their greatest fear is, it's different for everybody, isn't it? Their greatest fear is being drowned in the monsoon, when they were only going out to the shop to get milk. And get them to swap those around, swap around the hopes and fears, get them to write them out, tear them up, make a little game, little dominoes game out of them, whatever, pass them around and get people to experience imaginatively those extreme states, those extreme spheres, those extreme hopes. For example, that I'm going to go to heaven and I'm going to meet all my family that are dead, or I'm going to win the All-Ireland, or Mayo are finally going to win the All-Ireland, or whatever. So get them to enter into the imaginary dystopia and the imaginary utopia. So again, that's what you're teaching there, utopia and dystopia, and get them to write as if those things have actually happened, okay? Look, another one there, I talk about experience of changes. This is a big one. It's an exercise I do called the sun and the shadow. Okay, so you ask people, what are the biggest, most difficult changes in their life? So a person might have been through cancer, a person might have just moved house, a person might have lost their child, a person might have lost their father, whatever. Okay, so big changes that they've gone through. They were in a crash, they lost their legs. I don't know, everybody's got one, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in a human life. So I would say there, what I would say is ask them to think about what they felt like before it, okay? What they were afraid of before it, what the way their life was going before it, and then how they felt after it, okay? How they got over it, how they overcame it, what they lost, what they benefited from, and then you can talk about the heroic journey, as like we spoke about in one of the previous lectures, and that experience of change, that experience of anticipation, ordeal, event, and then overcoming and consequence has been a type of a hero story, or certainly a basis for a good personal narrative. Okay, so experience of changes, hopes and fears, dreams and nightmares stuff. That's all coming from people again. Remember, that's what I keep coming back to, is you generate material out of people's own experiences, their own desires, their own hopes, fears, lives, dreams, nightmares, all that sort of stuff. You don't bring extraneous stuff. You don't try and make them write, haiku or villanelle or any of that. I'll carry on. You just make them work with their own experiences. Yeah. Now, the senses obviously are obviously, something that you want to talk about a lot. Writing is a kind of virtual reality, and what we do, it's the oldest type of virtual reality, and what we're doing with writers is we're basically trying to stimulate the senses, and through the senses the imagination of our audience or our reader, so that our world becomes real to them. Okay, and the more powerful that the senses are stimulated in your writing, the more successful your kind of your imaginary composition will be to the reader. Okay, one exercise I do, for example, is the noticing exercise, which is simply tell people, and this I do often as the first week's homework actually, is the noticing exercise, which tell people to go off and walk down their street and find something that they've never noticed before, but has basically always been there, and they always find something that's always a surprise to them, and it's teaching them that, as writers, we've got to open our eyes wider, open our ears wider, smell better, see better, taste better, so that we're at the front line of the senses like that. Spying exercise, write about your neighbours, change their names, your weirdest neighbour, your strangest neighbour, what are they doing, what you think they're doing. The walking exercise, go out for a walk and just note down the things you see, and note down the things that come into your head, and note them down under the 5 headings of the senses, and the 6th heading, the 6th sense, okay, the atmospheric sense, what it feels like to walk into a building, an abandoned building. What if somebody weird sits near you on the bus, and you get this feeling. So talk about the 6th sense as well. A favorite place you have ever been to. People will have, great memories of places, and those places will normally be sensual memories to a degree. They'll have the smells and the tastes and the sounds. Or place you've not been to, and what would the moon be like? What would the back of the sun be like? What would, Margaret Atwood's living room be like? I don't know. And this helps a lot with cliche proofing, because it forces people to use their own words to describe things. Second one there are, number 8 overall, but second on this sheet, is objects and belonging. To write about an object with sentimental value, what it is that you value it. Now, this can be a really good exercise, I find, for maybe week 2 going into week 3, where you ask them to bring an object from their house that has been around maybe in the family for a while, or been in their life for a while, or they got it from someone, or they found it somewhere, or they bought it somewhere. And why does this object mean so much to them? How does it fit into their life? And you get some great stuff. People bringing in gas masks from their attic, old paintings, old jewels, old photographs, things like that. So a great way for the people to get to know each other as well as that, and to build that rapport and build that confidence between people. And then another one I would use, in those first 2 or 3 weeks is, and this is the last kind of idea I'll give you around it, is personal dictionaries, sayings, slangs, place names. Again, helps with the cliche proofing I'll be talking about, and gets people to see with their own words and experiences as their creative resource. Thinking that, what do I create out of? You're trying to teach them to create out of their own selves and what they've got inside themselves with the tools they have to hand, as we spoke about in lecture 1, which it might be a good idea for people to go back over actually at this stage. Okay, so personal dictionaries, the words that they only heard in their own townland when they were growing up, the words that they only use in their own family, the words, and you do this in schools with kids, by the way. They absolutely love it because every school has its own vocabulary and they have great fun explaining to you. But we're talking about adults now. So sayings that they like, slang that they like, unusual place names or townland names and stuff like that, and get them to describe them. So just again, working with natural language, natural speech that comes from the earth and from the people themselves, rather from the BBC newsroom or whatever. Okay, so I think there's lots there for you to build up exercise out of. Now I've given you 9 different leads there and lots of talk about exercise, but again I do emphasize they really work, because I made up all these exercises, and when you get into the swing of it, it's hard to get going, but when you get into the swing of it, obviously they're similar to loads of other exercises that creative writing teachers do all over the world, and other types of artistic teachers as well. So I'm not claiming to have come up with everything, but I've made these up in the form that they are now, and you should go off and make up your own ones in your form as well, because it'll make your teaching easier and better in the long run. I can't overemphasize that. It's not creative writing teaching. People come into it sometimes and they think it's kind of an easy thing to do. I'm telling you, it's not easy to last for a long time, and you might get a couple of years out of it if you're kind of just doing what other people are doing. But if you're not enjoying it yourself, right, okay, so just a few general points then about what you should be doing in those first few weeks with people is general writing advice rather than individual feedback. So you don't kind of pick out individuals, you just praise individuals, say fair play, thanks very much. If they don't bring the homework, say, oh, don't worry about it, sure, listen in, and your feedback and your presence here is really important. It doesn't matter the homework, it's an adult class, and you should make that clear as an adult class, because people won't be used to doing homework, and they're going to try, really, you've got to understand that people are often coming from, they haven't been in a school for years. They might think they might have terrible, horrible memories of teachers. They might have terrible, horrible memories of homework and not doing homework. And be sensitive people as adults are as often as children, to be honest. And so, you want to just give general writing advice, talk about things, in general, good writing in general, rather than focusing on individuals in the first few weeks. You move on to that in the next phase, okay? And then I would also remember to be patient with people and to be positive all the time, okay? Happy. Thanks for coming. Great to see you. That was brilliant. Wow, etc. Just ham that up, and get people happy. Thirdly, then you direct people over time, and you're only kind of getting there in the first couple of weeks, but that's the aim, is direct people over time towards telling their own truths in their own words. Their own truths, imaginary truths, obviously. I'm not talking about like legal truths, but the truth of what comes from their own imagination. It's authentic to them. They made it up. Okay, that's what I mean here by truth. In their own words. So they're not writing like they think you should write, or they're not writing like the way their favorite writer writes. All of that takes quite a long time in the life of any writer, so don't put yourself under too much pressure, but as a general aim, you direct people over time towards telling their own truths in their own words, as I've said. In writing points, the 3 main writing points that I would cover in these first 2 to 3 weeks, and kind of structure my lesson plans around those, along with the exercises I've talked about, are down here. Okay, so basic sentence, paragraph, and story structure. So people will always often come to the class talk about, I'm good at starting stuff, but I can't finish stuff. So a class on beginning, middle, and end, and basic story structure, a little bit about that. In the first, basic sentence structure, subject, verb, object, correct word order, apostrophes, colons, semicolons. It's no harm, not overdoing the grammar, but definitely talking about, how to construct a sentence properly in the first couple of weeks. And talking about sentences, I said there in the second line, as clean and short, containing mostly subject, verb, and object. Now, if you don't know what a subject and object, I assume you know what a verb is. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say subject and object, then you need to learn a little bit of grammar. This isn't a grammar class, so I'm not going to teach that. But you need to know a good bit of grammar before I teach creative writing, because people will ask about using apostrophes and semicolons and things like that. And particularly in the case of poetry, the placing of these is a kind of musical notation. So you have to be, well able to use them themselves and know where they go, and able to teach where they go, and fit that in for maybe 5 or 10 minutes towards the end of the class. Talk about those. Okay, correct word order. People will often, especially if they try writing long sentences with lots of clauses, they won't have words in the right order. So maybe some little exercise around correct word order as well. Not overdoing it, like I say, but getting it in there. Okay, the verb. I'm going to teach a poetry lesson to in a few minutes, where I'll go into more detail and example this. But the verb is certainly the most important part of any sentence, because it tells us when a thing is happening, what is happening, who's doing it, and who it's being done to. There's a huge amount of information contained in a verb. So it really emphasizes getting people's verbs right, getting the right verb to describe the right action, over what people will often think is writing in their beginning, which is flowery language, which is lots of adjectives, adverbs, and lots of flowery description. Now, I would very quickly in my beginner's class basically ban adverbs and adjectives. Beginner writers overuse them because they think it sounds fancy and literary. It's the opposite, really. Very, very, very few serious writers make a hell of a lot of use of adverbs in particular, and of adjectives. They're used very sparingly, generally speaking, as well. You might like to use something from, a great writer like Ernest Hemingway, for example, to example how to write clean, short sentences which tell so much and condense so much without using any flowery language at all. And you see that little quote I've got there, which is from Ezra Pound, a great writer, terrible human being, and he wrote, if you catch an adjective, kill it. And I think that's quite a good one to put up on the board. So, basically the writing points you want to get across are all to do with cleanness, clarity, good structure, and basically transparent writing, so that when the reader reads it, it's as if they're looking through a window onto the world, rather than trying to kind of decipher what's going on with adverbs and adjectives and all that. You might move on then to talk. You'll have talked about cliche proofing and using their own words and their own language, and coming up with their own metaphors and their own similes and things like that to a certain extent. Don't overdo that, but do get the idea across that they've got to get rid of cliches out of their writing. You might also want to talk with them about, because most people will have cliched themes and cliched characters as well as those cliched phrases. So you might want to talk to them about cliche type character types and typical themes and storylines that you would find in contemporary women's fiction or contemporary crime fiction or different types of fiction, and then try and brainstorm with them about how would you put your own twist on that, because of course if we're writing genre, we use the genre conventions, but good genre always puts a twist on those as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that during the first few weeks as well. And when critiquing, it's very important to always give people something to go on, ideally development of what they've presented. So I'll give you that example of the woman who brought me a ghost story from her townland, and then of course I just will go and get another one. So it could be as simple as that, or it could be just basically giving people little hints and pushes about how to continue their story, how to rewrite their poem, but always giving them something to go on based on what they've got already. Then that means you're working with what we talked about in the first lecture, the Vygotskian idea of the zone of reflective capacity. It's taking where the student has got to and giving them a challenge which they can reach and which kind of develops out of where they already are. That's teaching, basically, in a nutshell, creativity. Giving them something to go on, where they, from what they've already presented, and this avoids a sense of failure. So you don't want to say to people, "Oh, that's terrible, that's awful, that doesn't work." You want to say, "Well, it's really good. I really like it, but these are the changes I would make, and this is where I would move it on." So always keep that emphasis on, you've made a good start here now, and avoid a sense of failure in students, because if they have that sense of failure in the first couple of weeks, they won't come back. And it is possible, much more possible for an adult class to just completely collapse, and you have nobody there in third or fourth week, and you won't be asked back by the VEC to teach again then, I can tell you. So really keeping them in the room, over the course of the 8 or the 10 weeks, I don't want to underestimate the difficulty of that, and it is to do with that atmosphere and that positivity, and and also getting them working, getting them doing things, because, you might be a great genius, but the class is about them, and if they're working and improving, then they'll come back every week, and they'll be satisfied clients, if you want to use that type of language. So focus on them, focus on the students getting right and getting positive and moving forward, cleaning up their language and learning about basic structure and some basic grammar that you might want to go over. Okay. Now, also, you want to talk in the first couple of weeks to people about the writing life and the writing process. Okay, so you want to tell, these are 3 tips I would talk to people very, you don't want to overload them with writing advice, and writing advice is an awful racket, generally speaking. I've just, I looked it up on the web there yesterday, and I found several books on novel writing written by people who, haven't written any novels and that sort of stuff. So I don't want to overdo the writing advice, but you do give some from your own practical experience as a writer, or, one my practical experience as a writer certainly is that you need to make time and space. So time and space, you'll have to talk to students about sacrifice, and sacrifice is moving something out of your life to make room for writing, because you do have to move something out. So it might be Netflix, or it might be the bridge club, or it might be something like that, but emphasize to people that if they want to, as they go on, become serious about writing and make it part of their life, either as a therapeutic thing or as a professional thing, and people have the choice of doing both, really. Then they do have to make that time for themselves, which comes from somewhere else usually for adults, because adults have kids and they've got jobs and they've got voluntary commitments and all kinds of things, and finding that hour or two a week, and I would emphasize that no more than an hour or two a week to begin with, and make it achievable for people, even in a half an hour. So the time that they're using in the first couple of weeks, you're giving them homework that can be done in an hour, and just getting them used to doing it, and talk to them about regularity of time. Regularity of time and regularity of space. Space, even if it's only a little corner in your attic or your bedroom or in the basement or wherever, somewhere that is your writing desk, where nearly, where what goes on there is writing, and when you sit down there at your regular time in your regular space, a kind of neurological trick happens where your brain, this is my creative zone here now, and you kind of zip into creativity, and explain to people that will happen over time, and they'll have that creative time and creative space, and that will help them to get going faster. So a regular place and a regular time, and talk about the importance of that to writing. And then talk about the 3-part writing process, which I will tell you what that is. It's not very difficult, probably obvious to everybody. First, you think. Okay, so when I give them homework in week 1, I say, I don't want you to go off and do the homework now straight away. I want you to think about it. Okay, it's Wednesday night. I don't want you to even. I want you to think about it until Saturday. I don't want you to bring any. Maybe take a couple of notes. Okay, but don't try and write anything substantial until Saturday. Saturday or Sunday, then, when you've had a couple of days to think about it, because mostly writing goes on in the unconscious. Remember, okay. You can sit down and write it. That's not the end, though. The 3rd part is rewriting, and I want you to do that on Tuesday night or Wednesday morning or just before the class. So what we've got is something fresh to critique. So you go through that process of thinking about the prompt that you give them. They go through it. Then writing their first draft, and you can talk to them about drafting. They may have never heard of drafting. Okay, so you can talk to them about that. And the 3rd part, rewriting, and that's what they bring to the class, to be critiqued and to be redrafted again in the light of the critique. So it's kind of a 4-part writing process, but you can boil it down to 3 for anything anybody's ever written. They've been thinking about it, they've wrote it, and they've rewrote it. So getting them into the idea that writing is that kind of 3-stage thing, not to be rushed and not finished just after you've kind of just written your first draft. A way I explain to people about drafting is that if you compare writers to sculptors, okay? Sculptors are lucky because they have a rock, right? A shapeless piece of rock, which they bang and then shape something out of. Okay, they find the beautiful, statue of David in the rock, or whatever it is. Okay, but we don't have a rock. So we have to make a rock. So our shapeless, massive material, to a certain extent, is our first drafts, our first draft of our poem, our story, our novel. We have to make that rock so that we can hammer away at it afterwards. And our second and third drafts or whatever is us chiseling out the rock that we have made. So we've got kind of one extra job to do that, say, sculptors, don't have to do. Okay, and I think people generally understand it when I explain it like that fairly well. Okay, so that's a 3-part writing process. And then the last thing that I would say to people is very important. Now, I say notebooks there and having an idea bank. Now, notebooks these days are smartphones, generally speaking, and you can teach people how to use a notes application, a free notes application on their smartphone. I'd advise you to do that. Again, adults over 40s, over 50s, they mightn't have done that, but if you teach them how to do it, they'll absolutely love it and they'll be grateful. These are not difficult things to use. And with the notes application that I use on Apple, or the Evernote that you can get on Android or whatever, you can take photographs, you can take little notes, you can take a voice memo, you can do all sorts of things. And really, we want to be encouraging people to make the full use of that wonderful technology that's changing writing at the moment. So when I say notebook, leave your smartphone beside the bed, or if you're old style, leave your notebook beside the bed, because often, and tell people this as well, that often your best ideas will come while you're out for a walk, and it's not convenient. Walking stimulates the brain, a little bit of serotonin, makes you forget about your worries and stuff like that. So Brendan Kennelly's advice to me, the great Irish poet, when I asked him how did he write his poems, he said, I go for a walk, and that was that, and that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so getting people out walking with their notebook and building up an idea bank. Okay, and another time that ideas come to people that is kind of inconvenient, but it comes to creative people quite a lot, is when you're in bed and you're just about to go to sleep and you're in that twilight shadow zone. But when you're just about to go to sleep, I wrote a whole book out of literally from writing those mad thoughts that came into my head in that twilight zone down, just the thought, leaving it there and wake you up in the morning and writing the rest of the story based on the first thought. So a lot of people will have that kind of know what you're talking about when talk that twilight creativity zone. Tell them to leave the smartphone and notebook beside the bed, write it down and forget about it and go back to sleep. So, different ways of keeping notebooks is an important thing to teach people, and to teach people to keep a notebook, because if we're creative people, we have loads of ideas all the time, and we need somewhere to put them and record. Let's look at a simple poetry class, but nevertheless comprehensive poetry class that I would teach as an introductory or as a beginner's section, maybe around week 3 or 4 of a course, when I've got the warm-ups done and got a lot of material generation and got people feeling comfortable with their thoughts and expressing themselves and so on and so forth. So you've done the groundwork, and you're kind of bridging in between the construction phase and the production phase, which we will talk about in lecture number 5. And what is poetry? I would write on the board just like that, and I'd elicit a personal definition from everyone in the class, okay, and get them to write it down, and I'd also ask them, do they remember any poetry, or do they read any poetry, or what's their favourite poem, or where do they hear poetry, and just talk about poetry, what kind of function it plays in society these days. Is it more or less than it used to be before, and that kind of thing. Just a general discussion about poetry, getting people thinking about it, and going by their own definition. And everybody, you'll have your own definition of poetry, that's fine. We're all entitled to our own definition of poetry, but my definition here is what you might call a practical definition of a person who writes poetry, and is supposed to be not too bad at it, and has been doing it for a long time. So it works for me, and I've used it in teaching quite a few times, and it's gone down well, and it's focused people. Now, it's not going to be cover everything that's ever happened in the history of human poetry, but it's a beginner's class we're dealing with, and you don't need ambiguity when you're dealing with a beginner's class. You need kind of clarity on definitions. You also don't need to go too deeply into technical terms, alliteration, assonance, all that kind of stuff. You can do a little bit about that or do a sheet about it, but not quite, not quite essential at this stage. And if it ever is, I'm not too sure for poetry. But the definition I put on the board and the order of the words is important. And then I will go through what I mean by those definitions with you. So a melodious procession of memorable images. The first term is the most important. Poetry is a form of music. For 99% of its history as an art form, it was accompanied by music during all throughout human oral history, and into the Middle Ages with the troubadours, who accompanied it. So poetry is basically we don't call it lyric poetry if we call it that for a reason, because it's originally tied very much to music and broke away from music, in the late Middle Ages after the printing press and so on and so forth. But it's kind of coming back with the advent of performance poetry now into a more musical, vocal, oral form. Poetry is kind of music. It has to sound, when you read it, like a song. Okay, it has to have that rhythm, some rhyme, some melodious qualities, the qualities of harmony and so on. And it flows out. Poetry is fluent. It flows like a river out of your tongue, down your throat and out of your tongue. And, to find out if your poem is working, you read it aloud to yourself. And is it melodious? Is it musical? And so on and so forth. If it is, it'll be... and the second term is procession. In other words, one line unfolds from another. One maybe not in a logical way, often not in a logical way, but in an associative, poetic way. They unfold, the lines unfold from each other, and the poem then has a kind of a unity, and possibly, as we'll see, it kind of loops back, as poems often do, to the beginning of the poem at the end. But that procession, that there's movement, is very important. There's that a poem moves from beginning to end, and that there is often a metamorphosis or a transformation or a looping back at the end of the poem. And don't worry too much about what I'm saying there. We'll have a look at an actual poem in a second to see what I mean by all of this. So procession, unfolding of memorable. Yeah, absolutely. Poetry is the art of memory. The muse of poetry is Mnemosyne, who is the Greek god of memory, basically, or the muse of memory. And it was invented by human societies as a means of remembering the important events in their history. And it was what human beings used to remember the important events in their history, or the important myths, or the important religious tales and so on and so forth, up until really the advent of the printing press. For most people, the poem or the epic poem would have been the form of memory. So a lot of the technical side of poetry, including all those musical things like alliteration, asin, and so on and so forth, and end rhyme in particular, are inventions of oral societies using them as tools for memory. A lot of people will ask you, does a poem have to rhyme? And you have to explain to them, well, no. In 1640 or 1650, John Milton, in his preface to Paradise Lost, said rhyme is the relic of a barbarous age. And, he was just basically saying in a sort of a negative way what I'm saying in a positive way, that oral cultures used end rhyme in particular, as a trick of memory. So poets don't have to rhyme. You can rhyme if you want. It doesn't have to be end rhyme. It can be internal rhyme, all that sort of stuff. So you might want to, stop here and talk about memory and how we might remember differently in contemporary society, and that has to do with the images. Now, poetry's always had images, of course, and with creative writers, what we're doing is we're stimulating the human imagination. And if you, William Burroughs, again, I think I've said this to you before, but if you can't write it, if you can't draw it, he says, don't write it. And this is particularly the case with poetry, and this is what you have to get across to people really big time with poetry. Poetry is not abstract, flowery, vague language talking through your hat about things that nobody can really understand. Poetry is actually close description of an event, and close description and imaginative description of an event in the form of images, striking, novel images which we haven't heard before and which leave an impression on us and are therefore add to the memorability of the piece. Okay, so we've got that melody, music, procession, unfolding, memorable. The poem is set up. It's a machine for remembering itself, as the poet Don Patterson says, and images. It's not vague, it's not abstract, it's not flowery language at all. It's an actual description, imaginative description of an actual event or an imaginary event. Now let's move on a little bit to a poem. I think, almost the perfect poem of the 20th century, and certainly a great poem for teaching what poetry is to beginners. This is First Party at Ken Kesey's with Hell's Angels. People might have heard of Ken Kesey. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, leading figure in the Beats. Not the leader of the Beats, probably that was Allen Ginsberg who wrote this poem, and about the Hells Angels, who again were part of the counterculture, in a complicated way. And this is the beautiful poem that Ginsberg wrote, I think about 1963. Cool black night through redwoods, cars parked outside in shade, behind the gate, stars dim above the ravine, a fire burning by the side porch, and a few tired souls hunched over in black leather jackets in the huge huge wooden house, a yellow chandelier at 3 a.m., the blast of loudspeakers, hi-fi, Rolling Stones, Ray Charles, Beatles, Jumping Joe Jackson, and 20 youths dancing to the vibration through the floor. A little weed in the bathroom, girls in scarlet tights, one muscular, smooth-skinned man sweating, dancing for hours, beer cans bent, littering the yard, a hanged man sculpture dangling from a High Creek branch, children sleeping softly in their bedroom bunks, and 4 police cars parked outside the painted gate, red lights revolving in the leaves. So, let's see. Going by our definition of poetry, is it melodious? It certainly is. It doesn't use end rhyme, but it uses a lot of internal rhyme. It's a very fluent poem. There's no stage at all when your tongue trips up. There's no awkward constructions. There's a lot of pace in the poem. It slows down, it speeds up, it contracts, it expands, and have a look at the poem and see where that's happening. And you got to be able to see that to be able to teach poetry. You got to be able to talk about poetry and how it works to be able to teach it. It's not my job to teach you how poetry works. If you're going to be a creative writing teacher, you're going to have to, hopefully you have some idea already. So procession, you will see that we have at the we go through the whole party here, and the great thing about poetry as well, it condenses information imagistically through images. So we start at the beginning of the party, which is a cool black night through red woods. Okay, first thing to notice here is that black and red, are kind of subtly black and red are the colors of anarchy and anarchism, and I suppose colors associated with the counterculture overall. So there's kind of subtle signaling going on from the beginning as well as the close description. Okay, if you observe the use of the present continuous tense, what they call the gurrun, the ing form of the verb, or the present participle, also called in grammar, it gives it that sense of presence, of happening, of unfolding before our eyes, and not just our eyes, by the way. We've got all the senses stimulated here. We've got the music vibrating through the floor. You notice the poet doesn't say rock music. He names the people and makes that into a little bit of a rhythmic, a piece of music, Jumping Joe Jackson and 20 youths dancing to the vibration through the floor. A little weed gives us a smell, doesn't it? The hanged man is a kind of a striking sight image, and the red lights revolving in the leaves. What a wonderful, wonderful, image that leaves so much, that leaves an impression on us. And, we want to talk about how poetry is memorable in the 20th century. It's probably more to do with these impressive images, these images that leave a lasting impression on us, than it is to do with rhyme anymore, okay? Because, our culture is so visual now in so many ways. So, a couple of other points to make about this poem. It begins in the middle, okay? There's no introduction, really. Okay, we're straight into the action, and that's what you get from the Greeks. Okay, the Greeks didn't start poetry with a big introduction or start their prose with a big introduction. You went straight into the middle of action. A filmic technique, by the way. If you go and see a war film, they're not going to give you a big long introduction about how the war gets started or anything like that. You're going to be right in the middle of the battlefield from the beginning, and that's the way you want it with your poems as well. It's written in the present tense, not the past tense. Past tense should be used, very rarely, only when there's a good excuse for it. In poetry, things should be happening in front of your eyes, and give it that ing form, give it that present tense. Sensual imagery. We stimulate the imagination through the senses. So there is smells, there is sights, there is sounds. Close description. He's describing the cans bent littering in the yard, the red lights revolving in the leaves, and if you do that close description, you avoid cliche. As simply by describing the world as it is, you avoid describing it as it's not, or as you're kind of, you've been toxified or poisoned by the journalistic language of our culture, the cliche-ridden language of our culture. The way to avoid that, absolutely essential for poets, is close description. It describes an event. An awful lot of people these days think poetry is, about the feelings that they have inside their head, or all of that kind of stuff, and it's not at all, not in the least. It's about things that happen, often that happen to you. Most often, poetry is not about things that happen to the person themselves. That's an illusion of our contemporary culture, and I would certainly encourage people to write not about themselves. You can invest yourself emotionally, spiritually, all that sort of stuff in your poem, but you definitely want to be writing not just about yourself and your own feelings and so on and so forth. A metamorphosis occurs in the poem. What I mean by that is that there's a change. We start at the beginning of the party, anarchy, red and black, and then the black is gone by the end, and we've only got the red lights, the police coming to close down the party. It's an allegory. If you don't know what allegory is, look it up, okay? Allegory is, the poem stands in an allegorical relationship with the whole of its culture and the whole of its time. Now, can you guess how? Basically, the 1960s, if you want a one sentence description of the 1960s and maybe the 1970s up until, Reagan and Thatcher, was a confrontation between the counterculture and the old culture, a confrontation between the underground, the grassroots, the workers, the students, and so on, and the beats and the artists with the old fogies, the official church, the official state, the police, and so on and so forth. And this poem allegorizes dramatically that confrontation. So it's in fact, as well as being very much about a single event, it's also about the whole of the 1960s and the 1970s. And that, that's one of the reasons why it's such a great poem. And great poems do have that allegorical relationship. They condense and they dramatize and they narrativize. They tell the story of their whole generation, through their own story. So all of those things are very important about poetry. Again, if you're teaching a beginner's class, you will have to teach a class on poetry. You certainly don't have to use my definition. It is the definition of a practicing poet who's been at it for 20 years and teaching it for 20 or 30 years. So, give it some consideration. But if you have your own, that's fine. This is a good poem to teach what poetry is all about and what it can do. Ken Kesey with Hell's Angels by Allen Ginsberg. But you may have your own favorites. Don't make them vague, abstract, or too highfalutin. Make them about something that people can relate to. Everybody can relate to being at a party, so find something like that, and don't go over people's heads, please, especially in that beginner's class. So that's what I got to say about poetry. Now, next lecture is about we've covered part 1 of teaching a general introductory adult class and how to get the material generating. And if you do that right, it means you'll have them coming in week 4, week 5, and week 6. If you haven't done that beginning right in 1, 2, or 3, your class will shrink, or nobody at all will turn up in week 4 or 5, and believe me, that often happens because adults vote with their feet. So it's really important, that first part. It's important that you're able to teach kind of one-off classes as part of that, or just one-off classes on things like poetry and the short story. I've given the example of how I would do it there. Do come up with your own.